system came to unraveling. As he writes, quote, "The simple truth about the last year of the Trump presidency is that his lies turned deadly and shook the foundations of our democracy." In conversation with Jonathan this afternoon will be another veteran White House reporter, Peter Baker of the New York Times. Peter has authored several books himself on the presidencies of Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and co-authored 2 books with his wife, Susan Glasser, who's now with the New Yorker, including one about the early years of Vladimir Putin's rule and a biography last year of James Baker. He and Susan are currently working on their own book about the Trump years. So, Jonathan and Peter, take it away.
Brad, thank you very much for hosting this today. And thank you to Lissa, who's also working on her own book. And I can't wait to read that. And for anybody who doesn't know, Brad and Lissa are former colleagues of mine and my wife's at the Washington Post, and of course, own the best and most extraordinary bookstore in America. So we're so glad that you have become such an important place for people to gather, talk about big books like John Karl's here. So, John, I want to start by saying, first of all, I love your book. Betrayal is a great book. Anybody who's watching this should buy it. Buy it for Christmas, buy it for your parents, buy it for your uncles and your aunts, buy it for the people who love Trump, buy it for people who hate Trump. Everybody should read it. It's an important book. I want to ask you, John, what makes your book different than all the other Trump books? Because there are, as you know, of course, a lot of Trump books. My answer real quickly is I think that you provide a really smart, insightful, and powerful account of these last days that has reporting it that we hadn't seen from any of the others, as good as they were. And in my mind, I think you do a terrific job of framing the consequences of why this mattered. What happened there was not just a spectacle. That was part of it, obviously. Spectacle has always been part of Trump's brand, but this was important for Washington and for the country and for the world. And I think you do a great job of making clear why that is. Tell us why you wanted to do another Trump book. Tell us why you think this stands out as apart from some of the other ones.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you for doing this. You have covered the White House beat, I think, in a way. I mean, you're my go-to White House reporter, so it's an honor to be here with you. I think what is different about this book and what I set out to do in this book that is different is the entire arc of the book is trying to explain what happened, what led to the disaster that we saw unfold on January 6th. So the timeline arc is the beginning of 2020, beginning with the end of the impeachment trial, the first impeachment trial, and Trump's acquittal, which happened in the first week of February. But I don't try to exhaustively go through like some of the other books and deal with everything that was going on with Trump. What I do is I really try to provide the narrative arc of how we got to where we were, and I think that there are key themes that explain to how we ended up in that moment of crisis, and in focusing it somewhat more narrowly than other books, I was able to go through and focus my reporting as well, and I knew that the bar was going to be very high in terms of covering events that everybody saw unfold. That I had to get beyond just explaining the extraordinary events that we all saw, that you and I covered on a day-to-day basis. And Peter, like I imagine you do the same thing, but I've kept a journal. I've kept a journal since I was in college, and on and off to various degrees. But throughout 2020, I kept a rather detailed journal as I was covering these extraordinary events. And in that, I wrote questions that I had that I couldn't get answered. Covering the pandemic, covering Trump, the way he was approaching his reelection campaign, covering obviously the election itself and the disastrous transition that we saw, and Trump's efforts to undermine democracy. And I couldn't get all the answers under the crush of daily reporting. And I knew there was more to the story. And my first draft was really that journal, which enabled me to kind of direct my reporting and uncover things that I had no idea at the time, but I knew there was more to the story than what we were all seeing.
So, John, what's the most important question you wrote in that journal that you then went back to try to answer? And did you get the answer you were hoping for?
There were many important questions day to day. I think that, so I wouldn't pinpoint to a specific question, but the topic was, where was Trump getting this stuff? And did he really believe it? And who was he dealing with? Who else, who was getting to him? Because I sensed a very clear change that happened before the election itself, but certainly accelerated after the election. That something fundamentally was changing from the previous 3 years of the Trump presidency. The people that had been in there, who had been, Trump was always, as you and I have spoken in the past, Trump was always his own chief of staff. He was his own press secretary, his own communications director. But he did have people around him who tried to steer him. Reince Priebus wasn't exactly the strongest chief of staff we've ever seen, but Reince did things like, as you remember, when Jeff Sessions wants to, give his letter of resignation to Donald Trump, he stops him because he doesn't want him to have what he called a shock collar. So that anytime he can do something, Trump would threaten to put out the letter of resignation. There was nobody like Reince, even Reince in his relatively weak stances as a chief of staff, stepped forward and tried to keep this as a more traditional White House. Obviously, John Kelly took a more strenuous approach towards managing who was coming in and out of the White House. You had various others. By the time he got to the end, there was really none of that. And I wanted to understand why, what had changed. And that kind of led me to the whole Johnny McEntee story, which we can get to. But that was one big thematic question that I had.
Right. I do want to ask about Johnny McEntee. And I actually want you to tell some of the stories you discovered about some of the wackier theories that were being pursued. But before we get to that, you made news, I think, in some ways, partly by just posting some of your own interview with Trump online, in which he talks about Vice President Pence. And it was extraordinary and yet not extraordinary, right? I mean, in some ways, it's like, so tell us a little bit about what he said about Pence and why that struck you, that you wanted to make sure to highlight that people could hear that themselves through their own ears rather than just read your account of it in the book.
Well, just as a way to set that up, one of the strange and kind of chilling moments the very beginning of the year, was Lynn Wood. I think it was on New Year's Day, tweeted something suggesting that Mike Pence should face the firing squad. Didn't even explain why. It was really, really strange. And by the way, Trump hadn't been out there publicly yet talking about how Pence would have the power to overturn the election on January 6th. But clearly, Lynn Wood was in on whatever was going on. Lynn Wood, this kind of, this lawyer who was the peddler of the farthest out conspiracy theories regarding the election. And I tried to get anybody at the White House to react to it, to condemn it, to say something about it. And they were all seemed afraid to say anything at all about it. Here was a guy who had met with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, who had been a part of these lawsuits challenging the election results. So he wasn't formally part of Trump's legal team, but he was in the orbit. He was part of the larger team. And here was a guy calling for Mike Pence to face the firing squad. So Kelly McEntee, what can you tell me about this? Campaign, what can you tell me about this? Radio silence. And in fact, the only thing that came out hinting of a disagreement to this was from campaign lawyer Jenna Ellis on her personal account. And she said, she didn't say the campaign. She said, I disagree, basically. I disagree with the idea that Pence should be executed via firing squad. And then when January 6th happened and we all heard those chants of hang Mike Pence, I repeatedly reached out to the White House press office, Kayleigh McEnany and her team. Do you condemn these chants of hang Mike Pence? And hours went by and I got no response. Nothing. Finally, and then I actually went to Twitter to point out this, and it turns out that like 6 hours after I'd sent the inquiry in, somebody junior in her office had forwarded some statement that seemed to, condemn the chance. But I mean, it was amazing that the White House wasn't taking issue with it. So when I sat down with Trump, I wanted to ask him, first of all, I talked to him just over 2 months after January 6th. So it's still really raw. I mean, frankly, it's still to me really raw right now, but we were not that far from those events. And I wanted to see if there was any hint of remorse, or if not remorse, regret, anything. And I was just struck the way he was talking so glowingly about that day. He loves January 6th. He thinks that was one of the greatest days of his presidency, because people came from all over the country to Washington to hear him speak. He told me it was the largest crowd he had ever spoken before. I guess he'd have to revisit what he was saying about his own inauguration, but that's what he said. He told me that more than 1 million people turned out. I mean, not more than 1 million, but it was a very big crowd, and they were there to fight for him. And one of the things that Trump would always complain about to his own people is, you people don't fight for me. I need people out there fighting for me. So he loves January 6th. He'll tell you, he said, he added to me, it was marred later on. It was marred. He didn't go into detail. I assume he means the actual riot inside the Capitol building. But I was so struck by the lack of any regret at all that I asked him, Pence, were you worried about Pence? I mean, he was evacuated from the chamber, the Senate chamber, and he remained in that complex the entire time of the riot. And they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Were you worried for him? And no, I knew he was fine. And then the clip you're referring to is, I said, well, but they were saying terrible things. I mean, hang Mike Pence. And he says, it's common sense. It's common sense, John. It's common sense that you don't pass on fraudulent ballots. So in other words, of course they were angry. Of course they wanted, of course they were chanting terrible things because they were really angry. Amazing.
And that's something. So here's a question by John that a lot of people have asked of us, as well as other authors who have been exploring the subject. Why do you think President Trump talked to you? He knows he's not going to get like any kind of sycophantic book. He knows it's going to be, he'll know, if he understood correctly, he would understand it's fair and accurate, but he understands it's also going to be very tough. And yet he did. He sat down and talked with you. He's talked with other authors, talked with us. So why do you think he wanted to do that?
Well, I think, first of all, Trump has a tremendous faith in his own ability to convince people of things. That's one thing. And I found that during the course of particular 2020, even when he got furious at me and called me terrible names, said I was never going to make it, I'm a disgrace, third rate, all this stuff, he still kept on calling on me. And actually, there was one press conference where he said I was a third-rate reporter, I was never going to make it, and he was pointing. The photos are really kind of wild to see at this press conference. It was, I think, in the late spring, and he was pointing at me and clenching his jaw and angry, and I kind of went back at him a bit. He came back later in the same press conference and called on me for another question. So but I also think that this was a point, he craves attention, and to illustrate this is how the interview was conducted. The interview, I was told to arrive at 5 o'clock. The interview started at about 5:30, and it was right in the middle of the lobby at Mar-a-Lago, just as the members were coming in for happy hour, drinks, and dinner. And they all have to walk right by me interviewing him in the middle of the lobby. So when you listen to the tape, you hear, the noise of the people coming in and some glasses and whatnot. I mean, Mar-a-Lago isn't a huge place, but there are plenty of rooms where we could have gone and had a little private thing. He wanted everybody to know that here it is. And at some point, and it's kind of funny because the way he's talked about me and subsequently, in the transcript of the interview, you do see a few points where he's like, hey, look, I'm here with the great Jonathan Karl of ABC News. You see this, and he's trying to impress his folks that everybody's coming down to talk to him. So I think that's it. That was it. Oh, and I one other thing. They agreed to do an interview with me fairly early on. And I thought this was kind of nice. I get my interview for the book. And then like before I actually did the interview, before it was the scheduled date came, they announced that they were doing like a dozen interviews with various authors, some of them conservative friendly, but I was like, what is going on? There's like they're talking to everybody. And I found out the story behind it was Trump had taken a stand and said he wasn't going to do an interview with Bob Woodward.
Right.
And a publication, which I shall not name, but you could probably figure it out, reached out to, because they were doing a story about how Bob Woodward was getting stiffed. This is before all the other interviews were announced. No interviews had been announced. And how, after the experience with the last book, Trump was now refusing to talk to Bob Woodward. And one of Trump's, aides was like, that's not a good story for us. We don't like that, because the biggest problem is once that story runs, Trump's going to change his mind, and he's going to say, "Why aren't we talking to Woodward?" So they quickly said, "Oh, I've got to. If you don't do that story, I've got a better story for you." And they ended up doing a story about how all the interviews, Trump's doing all these interviews, which of course Trump loved the story because it showed everybody wanted to go down and talk to him.
Right. That is something, isn't it?
And they never got to the part about Woodward wasn't getting an interview. That was like the agreement with the story,
Well, I mean, in fairness, Woodward got like 18 interviews or whatever with him for the first book. So, I'm not feeling too sorry for Bob, but and these,
yeah, exactly.
But these interviews are interesting, right? Because, I mean, let's face it, as a fact witness, there are some challenges here, right? Our friends at the Washington Post tallied them up. They counted 30,000 things that the president had said during his 4 years in office that they considered to be false or misleading. So how do you interview somebody like that, and other people you probably interviewed for the book as well, who you're not sure are telling you the full truth? I mean, because in one thing I will say, you did a great job, I think, in your book. At one point in your book, you take, I think it's been a couple months now since I read it, but you take like 5 or 6 of some of the election claims, like there were more voters and there were more votes cast than there were voters in this county or that county. You did a very good job of debunking them one by one, showing how none of these things are true. They're all misunderstandings or distortions or whatever. So how do you deal then? And I ask this because we struggle with this ourselves, of course, as a journalist, as an author, as a historian. How do you deal with a subject you can't be sure is telling you the truth?
So first, before I get to directly answer that, on that question of the big elements of the big lie of all, the election was stolen, and the fact that we live in a country where, depending on what poll you're looking at, upwards of as many as 40% of the country believes that the election was stolen, and the vast majority of Republican voters. It's a very troubling thing, and I think that we as journalists have an obligation to try to do our part to explain why that is not true. And it's not enough to say there's no evidence, it's a lie, it's the big lie. I think that if you think about what happened on election night 2020, if you are not following politics super closely, you tune in to see who's winning the election, it was very confusing, because in the early hours of the evening, Donald Trump was ahead. He was way ahead in Pennsylvania. He was ahead in Michigan. He was ahead in Wisconsin. It looked like he was headed towards a re-election victory. It looked like that later. It looked like that at 11 o'clock at night. It looked like that when you were approaching midnight. And then if you went to bed and you woke up and then suddenly you're saying, "Holy, what is going on? Now he's losing." I mean, what happened? There's somebody. It's a scam here. Something. I think that, and we know the reason. The reason is because different states count votes in different ways. Mail-in votes take longer to process in some states, and Democrats vote more. We know all the reasons: the red mirage, the blue mirage, all of that. But I think it's important to take the time to explain it. So I went through some of the big ones, like the ballots under the table in Fulton County, the ballot dumps in Detroit, the dead people in a bunch of different places, and just not only showed why they were wrong, but did the anatomy of how the mistruths came to spread. And I think that's really important. In terms of how you handle somebody who you know is a serial liar, I think that this is one of the great advantages of writing a book over trying to document this stuff in real time, day to day. Both are incredibly important. You and I do both of those things. But when I sit down to interview Donald Trump in an interview for this week on Sunday, the cameras are on, we have an interview, maybe it can be edited, but often it's a live interview. He's going to be rapid fire saying things, that aren't true. And you have to try to do your fact checking in real time. And it's a real challenge. When I'm sitting down the interview itself was an hour and a half. I actually spent like 5 hours at Mar-a-Lago and spoke to him outside of the interview as well. I don't need to debate him on election fraud. I know the truth. He may not know it anymore. He may not have touch with reality on it, but I'm not going to put anything in my book that he's telling me about how ballots were stolen or manipulated or dead people. I mean, I don't need to correct him. I don't need to waste my time in the interview arguing with him. I'm trying to get inside his head.
But you would if he was on television, right? That's a difference, right? The book means you don't have to sit there and argue because you're not worried about viewers watching and being confused or misled or in some ways not fully served by our journalism.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why, when I'm talking to you about January 6th, you can see it's not a confrontational interview. I'm just trying to draw out what his way of thinking is. And I think on one hand, he's more relaxed in that setting. And I think he's more candid, and we're really hearing the unfiltered, what he believes. And it's not like a big mano a mano argument with him. I mean, I'm not there to argue with him. I know what he's saying is false. I'm not going to repeat it. I'm not going to put those things in my book. But tell me what you were thinking about January 6th. What were you thinking about? And that's what and by the way, I have to say, this book is the second most the most important thing I've done in my career as a journalist, and the second most important thing was the first book. I think that having the chance to go more in depth and to take a step back and to provide the context, is incredibly important and gratifying.
Well, again, I think what you really did is to make clear the ramifications and consequences of what was going on here, that it wasn't just performative politics, that something really big and historic was happening. For anybody watching, we're going to be taking your questions soon. Make sure to put them in the Q&A chat function at the bottom here. We'll ask as many as we possibly can. Also, make sure to click on the link that I think is in the chat function, where you can buy the book signed by the great author, John Karl. So, John, some of the conspiracy theories are really way out there. And you go through some of them that are just absolutely mind-boggling. There's Gina Haspel, the CIA director, is somehow being held captive in Germany. Italians are somehow involved with satellites that are rigging our vote. I mean, walk us through one or two of those, and what do they tell us about this White House, that they pursued them with such vigor and credit, and saw them as credible?
There are a number of them, and these are things that if you went to the darkest reaches of the internet, into QAnon, sites and the dark web, you would see, and you maybe wouldn't be surprised that people were, talking about completely wacky conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are as old, America's got a great tradition of obsession with conspiracies. But what was different here is that this did get the attention of the President of the United States and his chief of staff and the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Justice and the Pentagon, and that they acted on these things. So let me give you the one that just really, I can't say it's the nuttiest, because they all have a claim to that title. But the idea that the Italians controlled voting machines using military spy satellites, and that there were two gentlemen who were in prison in Italy accused of intellectual property theft related to a company named Leonardo, I believe, a defense contracting company, and that these two were confessing that they had been part of a scheme to steal the election for Joe Biden. And it turns out there are these two guys in prison, and they are accused of intellectual property theft, and it does relate to this defense contracting firm, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, they aren't confessing anything, and it has nothing to do with the United States election whatsoever. But this theory was propagated by a woman named Michelle Ballarin, who portrayed herself as a wealthy heiress, and actually set up shop at a 31-bedroom massive estate in Northern Virginia, and pretended it was hers, even though it was actually just for sale. She didn't own it at all, but she had a realtor's license, which enabled her to get into it. Unbelievable stuff. But she got meetings with very high-level officials, including a meeting that took place, I learned, at a parking lot outside a grocery store in Northern Virginia, with the top cybersecurity official at the National Security Council. This happened after the election, and she was passing on the information. Ultimately, the Justice Department was asked to look into it. There was, I recount, a Saturday meeting on January 2nd, by the way, which was the same day as the Raffensperger call. A lot happened on that Saturday.
Wow.
It was ordered by Mark Meadows, the acting defense secretary, Chris Miller, his chief of staff, Kash Patel, and Lieutenant General Barrier, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And they were asking him to activate the defense attaché at the embassy in Rome to go interview these gentlemen in prison and get to the bottom of this. And here's what I just learned from my Italian friends, who took a great interest as I tried to research that into this. There's been reporting now in Italy since my book came out that those two people were visited by somebody representing Trump on January 19th. They were still pursuing this one day before he left office.
Wow. Do you know who it was?
I've tried to. I don't know yet, but I'm tracking it down.
That's something. That is really something. I'm glad you're still on the case. I'm glad that this is.
Because I want to find out about these spy satellites and how.
Well,
do they
you gotta.
That's
pretty amazing. Those spy satellites. I mean,
Peter, the director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, was asked to look into thermostats made in China that were allegedly controlling the vote in Georgia. Thermostats. Made by Google in China. I mean, it's I'm
pretty convinced that new refrigerator that I've seen in the stores can control the right. But the thing is, like, you're right that like conspiracy theories are American in a very real way. But what's so different is that these type of people would never have gotten a phone call in. They would never have gotten the phone number of Ratcliffe, the director of national intelligence, in other intelligence, in order to bug him to do this. They would never have gotten an NSC official to come meet them at a parking lot to talk about this stuff.
Exactly. And in one of these instances, John Ratcliffe, who is, again, the director of national intelligence, he's the nation's top intelligence official. And, Meadows had actually given out his cell phone number to Giuliani and to Powell, and he was getting calls from them and all this. And he was pushing it aside because he knew it was crazy stuff. Trump himself asked Ratcliffe to investigate this wacky theory about Antrim County, Michigan, and being controlled by foreign. I can't even begin to explain. But and he said, can you please ask the FBI to investigate this? And it's interesting that Trump did this. The reason why he did this is, as you know, Trump hadn't spoken to FBI Director Christopher Wray for, the better part of a year. I don't even know when the last, but it'd been months and months and months and months. He was not on speaking terms with his own FBI director. So he was asking Ratcliffe to get FBI Director Wray to do this. And at first Ratcliffe said, look, we don't investigate. The DNI doesn't do it. The FBI does it. So Trump says, well, can you ask the FBI to do that? I said, well, that's not our thing. It's the FBI. And then Trump, somewhat smartly with the org chart of the U.S. government, said, but you're the director of national intelligence, and doesn't the FBI fall under you as one of those intelligence agencies? So
something, isn't it? And by the way, John Ratcliffe is not exactly an never Trumper. He is a strong
Oh my
Trump
God.
supporter. That's why he was made director in the
Totally.
first place. Not one of the rhinos, to use the word that we
Yeah.
hear. But we saw in Chris Christie's new book, right? He says that Trump blamed him for Chris Wray, your guy. He ranted and raved about Chris Wray because, in fact, Christie had recommended him for FBI. He thought he was a stand-up, solid guy, and obviously that's not what President Trump wanted in that job. Tell us about another name that might not be familiar to many readers, but really ought to be. A guy who is stand-up as far as the president's concerned, named John McEntee. Now, he was a college quarterback who was most known for a video of trick passes. I watched the video, by the way. They're pretty impressive passes. But suddenly,
They are, yeah.
John McEntee becomes one of the most powerful men in Washington. How does that happen, and what did he do?
He's the earnest kid, I had recounted in Front Row at the Trump Show when I first visited Trump Towers, the campaign headquarters, and there was nobody there because they hadn't really hired anybody besides Hope Hicks and Corey Lewandowski and like 5 other people. And one of them they had hired was this kid McEntee, just a few years out of college. And he was very earnest and very polite, and he gave me a tour of the place. I still have his business card he gave me, which I think he had made himself because Trump hadn't actually made cards yet for his campaign. But very, very eager to please guy, and he was what we call the body guy. He when Trump got elected, he carries the bags, on Marine One, on Air Force One, and all of that. But he was the kind of guy that would volunteer for anything. Always wanted to be with Trump, always wanted to be around Trump. So like one of the worst jobs if you're a White House staffer is when the president goes to play golf on the weekend, because you don't play golf with him, but you have to go and you have to sit there and wait, while he's out. And Johnny was always volunteering. He was always doing this stuff. Anyway, he got fired by John Kelly because of issues in his background check. And that was 2017, but he got rehired, now 29 years old, in the beginning of 2020. And I think he is the single most important figure to explain what happened in 2020 that people don't know. He became the head of presidential personnel at 29. As Mick Mulvaney pointed out, who was chief of staff very briefly, when McEntee came in, McEntee had never hired anybody in his life, and he was in charge of all the hiring and firing for the entire executive branch, all the political appointees, and he staffed that office. It's like 30 people. There's a great photograph in the book. You've got to check this out. There's a photograph in the book, and Peter, you might have gotten an early advanced copy that didn't have the photos.
Yeah.
There's a photo of Johnny McEntee and the people that worked in his office, about 25 of them or so, with Trump at like a holiday party, a posed shot. They're all standing together. And you see, it looks like a college group. Most of these people were in their 20s. Actually, 3 of them had never even graduated from college yet. And it was still, 2021. And these people set out at McEntee's direction to interview all the senior officials across the agencies about their level of loyalty to Trump. They scoured people's voting records. One person I talked to had been called out because they voted in a Democratic primary in Virginia a couple years earlier and were asked to explain why. Somebody else was asked to explain his wife's Facebook postings because there was a family photo that had a Biden-Harris watermark on it. And McEntee orchestrated the firing of people that were deemed insufficiently loyal to Trump, and made it possible at the end for Trump to have basically nobody around him anymore that was willing to challenge him in any way or even question him.
Tell us about, I was struck you put out a copy of this memo that Johnny McEntee wrote about Mark Esper. Mark Esper at the time was the defense secretary and had angered the president because he wouldn't, he resisted him on the Insurrection Act and had publicly disavowed the walk in Lafayette Square and all that. This memo is extraordinary because what it is basically is, you should say, it's a bill of particulars against Esper, who should be pushed out after the election, which he was. And what did tell us about that memo?
So this was a memo, and I have I had a lot of these memos that were done by McEntee's office. They were basically the product of those interviews I described, and they were made for those that McEntee thought should be fired, and it were bullet points, like basically their sins against Trump, and Esper's sins included things like he made moves to bar the Confederate flag on military bases. He opposed the president's. He opposed using active duty military to put down rioters in American cities. In other words, he opposed the Insurrection Act. He took steps for diversity and inclusion in the military. Again, sin against Trump. In his confirmation hearing, he vowed not to be political. Again, sin against Trump. He moved the department to be aggressive towards Russia. Another sin against Trump. And at the end of the memo, it outlines the recommendation from McEntee, which is fire Esper immediately after the election and have him leave immediately, and then replace him as acting secretary with Christopher Miller, who was the head of the National Counterterrorism Center. And what happened is the networks declared Biden the winner on a Saturday. It was the 7th, right? Mm-hmm. On the Monday, the 9th, Esper is fired. He's given less than an hour to pack up his office and leave the building. And Christopher Miller is brought right in, exactly as McEntee said. And then the following day, the entire civilian leadership of the Pentagon is decapitated. And again, there are memos for all these people. The Undersecretary for Policy, very powerful position, as you know, at the Pentagon, fired. The Undersecretary for Intelligence and Security, fired. The Chief of Staff for the Department of Defense, fired. All fired and replaced with handpicked loyalists that McEntee gave the stamp of approval to for being loyal to Trump.
We're going to take questions from the audience in just a minute. So one more quick question. A question that we struggle with as well about all of this, just when Trump talks about all these things that happened in the election or didn't happen in the election or what have you, do you think he believes it? Or does he know they're not true and he says it anyway? And I asked that because you had a very revealing conversation with Corey Lewandowski that you should mention after the election about what President Trump thought about what had actually happened.
Yeah, Corey had told me that he just wants to create enough doubts so that his supporters don't think he lost, but that he knows. And that was something I had heard from a number of people close to Trump in the immediate aftermath. Oh, he knows. Kellyanne Conway had told me that he'll give a concession speech. Well, it won't really be a concession, she told me. It'll be more like he concedes that it was stolen from him, but he'll acknowledge that the election's over and that Biden won. And I think now some of that was people around him hearing what they wanted to hear. But I think that Trump understood that he lost. And I don't say that with 100% confidence, but I don't think he truly believed all this stuff in the beginning. But I think what happened is he ended up believing it. And when I sat down with him in March, and I'd love to hear what your sense, what your sense on this is. You've followed him so closely too, since everything he said. I think he believes it now. I think he actually believes that there was massive fraud and it was all taken from him and he won. And I think that one of the reasons, and this is why I don't give you 100% confidence that it's quite possible he believed it immediately after the election too. And again, it was all wishful thinking of his aides who were saying that he understands, and this also gets to why there's 40% of the country that believes it was stolen. If you were following what was going on in the last weeks of the campaign, you saw Donald Trump doing 3, 4, sometimes 5 rallies a day. Some of these were they're all outdoor rallies because of COVID. And some of them were in Michigan and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and were in really cold weather, evening rallies. There's one I recount in Nebraska where like 30 people got treated for, and taken, and a bunch of them taken to the hospital, frostbite, other issues because they had been out in the cold for so long. But these people were packed. And they were chanting, "We love you," and they were waiting on line for hours and hours to be able to come into these rallies. Meanwhile, Biden was doing, if you were lucky, an event a day, and towards the end maybe two. They were drive-in events. I went to a bunch of them. You probably did too. They weren't all that crowded. I mean, how could they be that crowded? And they weren't that high energy. I mean, it looked like one guy was leading a national movement and one guy was kind of barely campaigning. And I mean, part of that, I mean, most of it, maybe all of it was because of the pandemic, and one candidate cared about the spread of the COVID and one didn't. But, they looked out of that and said, how could you lose? How could this be a losing campaign? Eric Trump on the way to, I recount this, on the way to Grand Rapids for the very last campaign rally of 2020, they're on the plane and Eric Trump asks everybody, okay, everybody, we're going to do final predictions. What do you think the electoral vote's going to come down to? And a couple of the Trump staffers predicted it would come down to 269 to 269, and it would go to the House and Trump would win there. And he looked at him and said, "You guys are crazy. This is going to be a landslide. We're going to get close to 380 electoral votes." And he believed it, and his father may have as well, because again, you start seeing that, and it looked like a winning campaign.
Yeah, no, it's no question. He had incredible crowds, and they were very intense, and you can see why people would think that somehow necessarily means you're going to win. Obviously, that's not the way the system works. You can have a very intense group of supporters, does not mean you have a majority to win an electoral college vote. Let's take some questions from the audience. Yeah.
I mean, I'll say just George McGovern, who lost 49 states. He won every city in America by massive numbers and had some of the biggest crowds in the history of presidential campaigns.
Right.
And he lost, 49 states.
Crowd size is important, but not necessarily indicative. He doesn't necessarily, anyway. So we take some questions from the audience. And by the way, don't forget, if you look on the chat function, you can click on a link there to buy John's book, already signed, which is great. Jody Hansen asks, if Trump were to run again in 2024 and doesn't pick Mike Pence as his running mate, who do you think he might pick?
I'm just going to throw it out there and say Kristi Noem, who's been clearly campaigning to be Trump's running mate.
Governor of South Dakota.
South Dakota. I think he would love the idea of having Kristi Noem out there campaigning.
And maybe she could put him on Mount Rushmore, which I think he would love.
Yeah, I mean, why not, right? She's. I think if it was anybody that can, it would be her.
Yeah. So Carolyn Bowers asks, how realistic is it to think that the current crop of journalists can make any dent in changing people's view of the big lie? What's the pathway?
So I think we can. I think that we can make an impact. I mean, it is part of why I wrote this book, and I hope it will have some impact. I'm not under any delusion that suddenly vast numbers of Trump supporters will look at this and say, "Oh, you're right, he was not telling the truth." But I think that if you kind of methodically again explain these things, bring the evidence, and don't just dismiss it just out of hand, because again, for that reason, if you were watching the election unfold, you could be a very good and decent human being and a smart person and think there's something screwed up. That's why you have to explain, well, this is what happened. And I did this through Bill Barr's words in some ways. Mm-hmm. Barr does a great job, for instance, describing, and check out this part of the book, Michigan, and what he told Trump about Michigan, and how he pointed out that, Trump's problem in Michigan wasn't that he lost, that people brought in massive amounts of illegal votes in Detroit, which is what Trump was alleging. He pointed out that Trump actually did better in Detroit against Biden than he did against Hillary. He lost Michigan because the suburbs, and particularly women in the suburbs, had nothing to do with how the votes were counted in Detroit. But anyway, I think you need to take the time to do it. And I think the January 6th committee has very important work to do, and they understand that public perception is what they have to. They need like a modern day equivalent of the Army McCarthy hearings, nationally televised, and dramatic telling of the facts. And I think that minds can be changed. Yes, not all of them, but I think minds can be.
So Eddie Miller asks, if Trump pulls a Grover Cleveland and wins the election in 2024, can our democracy survive a second term? Now, that's a hard question, I think, for a journalist who's not really in the prediction business, but I'm throwing it out there anyway, just to see what you want to say about it.
First of all, I got to say, one of the things I love about politics and prose is we can get a Grover Cleveland reference.
Exactly.
That is fantastic.
And everybody understands it too. It's not it's not an obscure one.
Right. And that's why, like, when I go to talk to like high school kids and you get the smartest kid in the class, I always ask, throw out a question and say, so how many presidents have there been? And now, Biden's the 46th president. 46. It's like, no, It's 45, dude. Cleveland counts twice.
He counts twice.
So I'll just tell you this way. A very senior person in the Trump administration, like, who I spoke to very soon after January 20th, told me that he was just kind of petrified by the idea of what would happen in a second term, and what a Trump cabinet would look like, what it all would look like, and it would all be kind of vetted by Johnny McEntee and his people, and it would all be it would be the people that would do whatever Trump wanted. That's what this person was saying. And I think that we would all have to be concerned about the future of American democracy. It is deeply concerning. And as a journalist, it's very hard. I don't know how. I mean, I think one of our great challenges is, how do we cover a campaign like that? How do you cover a campaign where one of the candidates running in a democratic election is anti-democratic?
Yeah.
And trying to undermine the very system that you're covering.
It's an excellent question, and one we may have to confront sooner than later. Yes. So we have a question here from a Mike McCurry. Anybody know that name out there?
I've heard this. This is vaguely familiar. Yes.
Mike McCurry. Anybody who might not remember, Mike McCurry was President Clinton's one of his White House press secretaries, and my first press secretary when I started covering the White House back in the day.
Mine too.
Yeah,
my first briefing was Mike McCurry.
And Mike set the standard, I think, for press secretaries of both parties about how to do the job, and I feel like I learned so much from him. So anyway, his question he's asking: most pundits say Trump will run in 2024. What would it take for him not to run? That's Mike's question.
Well, I think that the prospect of losing would keep him from running. And he may think that he won 2020, but I think that he knows that if he comes to know that he cannot win, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but look, he lost decisively last time around. And then he did all that led up to and included January 6th. This is not somebody that is going to suddenly turn around and win the suburbs again. And seasoned Republican operatives who are kowtowing and trying to placate Trump in every possible way know that the idea of him winning is remote for the way that he has so aggressively alienated the very voters he would need to win. So and Trump does not want to lose again. He does not want to lose again.
I agree with that. And I would add that I'm not convinced that he is going to run just because he says he's going to run at this point. That I think that, he's going to say that right up to the moment he doesn't, because he wants to keep the attention on him. He wants to keep the money coming in. He wants to be a player. He wants to be the big figure in the party. He wants to control who might run, even if he doesn't. And I think that he doesn't see any benefit to saying, no, I'm not going to run, until he actually has to pull the trigger one way or the other. So he may run. And I he surprised all of us on so many occasions that we shouldn't write anything off. I was just adding my answer to John's, which I agree with, about he doesn't want to lose. I think that's absolutely right. So Richard Goodstein asks, he recalls some things that Trump has said that, were pretty unfounded, let's say, and he wants you to comment on your assessment of his intelligence.
there are certain things he is very intelligent about. I mean, he's got a very keen visual sense. I mean, he is, and I called it the Trump show, the first book, because that was the way he perceived it. I wasn't trying to say that I think that this is some kind of show and it's all, but that is the way he perceived his presidency. And there were flashes of absolute brilliance in terms of how he presented that show. And I think one of those moments was his return from Walter Reed, which I asked him about. And he told me it was like a Broadway production. He was very proud of himself, but it was. I mean, here's the guy, he gets on the helicopter, Marine One, and lands on the South Lawn at right a little bit after 6:30. So it's at sunset, beautiful sunset in the background. It's just as all three networks have their 6:30 newscasts on. So there are some 25 million people tuning the news in addition to all the cable stuff and everything else, who he knows are all going to take it live. And he lands and he walks up the steps. And you and I know, because we've followed Trump so much, he never walks up steps anywhere. I think it's the only time in my life I've ever seen him walk up steps.
Yeah.
And he did it. He did it after recovering from COVID. So it actually had to be incredibly painful, just to get the breath. And then, the taking off of the mask and the looking out and saluting nobody, because there's nobody out on the South Lawn. So, you can't say that that he doesn't have intelligence. That he has a sense. He's very up on. Nobody consumed more news. No political figure I've ever covered consumes as much news as Donald Trump. Now he consumes a bunch of garbage too, but he knows exactly who you are. He knows what you have done. He knows how respected you are, and that's why if Peter Baker asks to go see him, he's probably going to say yes. He goes into that briefing room. He knows. I remember him calling on Phil Rucker one time during the first year, and Phil Rucker, I mean, now he's a super mega best-selling author. The world knows Phil Rucker, and we knew him before because he's a great reporter for the Washington Post. But he's not exactly, Trump knew exactly who Phil was. And not only that, he started citing a story he had done during the New York primary. He said, hey, that story you did about the Staten Island ferry, that was a very good story. Now I know, and he had talked to Phil and all, but still, I mean, the idea that a president coming out and pointing to and recounting a story from like a year ago that was, so there's something there. There's a lot of delusion, but there's something there.
So Judy Squires asks, she says, there's some thinking from analysts that the news media has not learned the lessons of 2016, that there's still a lot of false equivalencies that help Trump and his GOP acolytes. What do you think?
I mean, look, first of all, and because we've had this discussion so many times, one thing I just kind of reflexively dislike is this notion of the media as if it's the media. I mean, there's the New York Times, there's ABC News, there's Politico, there's Axios, there's Breitbart, there's Fox News, there's OAN. I mean, there is a universe. There's Bloomberg. They all have different audiences, different approaches, different editorial standards, and all of that. So I'm reluctant to answer that question, to give an overarching generalization. But I will say, just to break my own rule for a second, the so-called mainstream media overgeneralizing, I think, fully has a much different approach to covering Donald Trump now than was in 2016. And I don't think that is. I think that, like, when was the last time CNN carried a Trump speech like gavel to gavel? They didn't even continue to do that at the end of the campaign in 2016. I mean, it was they did early on, and I think that they would acknowledge that was a mistake.
I think that's right. Donna Howard basically asked a very similar question, so I'm going to read it, and you can see if there's anything you want to add. But she says, "You guys have a tough job especially in the current environment, do you agree with people who say that the mainstream media are failing the American public by continuing to act as if both parties are equally committed to democracy and just have policy differences?
I just wrote a book. I just wrote a book called Betrayal that outlines how the most prominent figure of one of those parties tried to destroy American democracy. So I don't think I'm engaging in false equivalencies. I don't think you are either. Some might be, I don't know, but unfortunately not a media spokesperson.
No, I know. But the part of the challenge then is, okay, then you hear people say, well, then you should never interview anybody who believes this or advocates that or makes these, false assertions. And I get the question, I do. So does that mean then you've decided you disqualify, the entire Republican Party or the entire members of Congress who voted to overturn, the election results? That's a hard thing. I've heard some hosts on TV say, I'm not going to have so-and-so on because they propagate the big lie. I understand that. Where's the line drawing? Because it's our job as journalists to want to expose and give people a chance to present their point of view and then challenge them when they say things that are not true. I would just add that I just think I appreciate that Donna says it's a hard job, because I do think it is, it's not an easy, clear cut. We should do this and not that. And that somehow the world will be a better place if we follow this very clear line. And I think John's point, and this is not my show, this is your show, but John's point about media being a single entity, it's not. There are so many different people, not just different organizations, but even within the organization, we have different tasks and different jobs, right? So MSNBC, ABC, the New York Times will hire columnists or commentators or pundits who are entitled to. In fact, we want them to share their opinion. We want them to argue it out. That's their job, which is great. But that's different than what John or I do. And John or I are reporters. We're trying to bring you the facts as best we can with analysis, not just simply stenography. But there are different jobs here. So anyway, Elizabeth Morawski, I'm probably mispronouncing, Morawski, asked if elections can be overturned because of recent voting laws. What then do we think about Trump running 2024? In other words, I think actually is a fair point to our previous dialogue about whether he runs or not. Does he think that some of these laws that have been put in place in some of these states change the equation in terms of being able to tilt the odds one way or the other?
He's certainly working at that. I mean, one of the weird things in my last conversation I had with him over the phone, he was telling me about Texas auditing their vote. Now they were going to do an audit. And now this has been out there, but I hadn't even heard it yet because it hadn't been announced. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you won Texas. Why are you auditing the vote in Texas? And he got really indignant and angry about it. I mean, he wants to go through and change the way elections are run state by state. He's not going to succeed, overall, but there are, I mean, he is having some success.
We need to let John go. He's got another thing in front of him, but we're so happy to have been here today. And I turn it back over. Thank you, John, for including me in this conversation. I really enjoyed it. It's a big, fantastic book. Seriously, go out and buy it. And there are, I think, on this web chat, a link for the signed copies. And now turn it back over to Brad.
Yeah, and we've had everyone mentioned from Grover Cleveland to Mike McCurry. So what a classic VP event. Terrific moderating.
By the way, whenever I think Grover Cleveland, I think Mike McCurry too.
Of course, right.
Grover would never have lost that first time if McCurry had
been not if he had a guy like McCurry. No.
There you go. That's the connection. So anyway, terrific moderating, Peter. And John, you've definitely advanced the sum total of what we know about that fateful final year of Trump. And of course, what's so unsettling is that the more we know, the scarier it all looks in retrospect. It's just so fascinating and interesting and instructive listening to you and Peter too talk about how, having been so close yourselves to all that craziness that was happening, you continue to process it and try making sense of it. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, as you've heard already once or twice before, there's a link for purchasing copies of Betrayal. And also, as you've heard, we do have signed copies, thanks to John's visit to the store today. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.